I'm going to talk about how the road to serfdom has sadly become relevant again. And I say sadly because I would prefer to live in a world where it isn't relevant. Because this was, of course, the purpose of this book was not to describe the best possible society. It was just about how to avoid the most hellish type of society. And it would be great if we could say we have at least moved on from that. We have at least put that debate behind us. And there was a time not so long ago when you could have said that, when it looked as if this old debate between market economy versus planned economy, as if that was a thing of the past, a 20th century Cold War kind of debate. There was this quarter century after the end of the Cold War when there was a widespread perception, rightly or wrongly, that this debate was largely over, that the supporters of the market economy had, broadly speaking, won, and that there was now a consensus across most of the political spectrum that a successful economy has to be largely a market-based economy. Now, there can be disagreements within that, and there was, of course, there was never a consensus on what the role of the state should be and how far markets should go and all that. But it seemed for a while that most people, including on the political left, accepted that, broadly speaking, an economy has to be market-based. And these old debates, the things that Hayek talked about, capitalism versus non-market economies, that was a 20th century phenomenon, and that we have moved on from that. Well, it turned out that was not the case. In the last 10 years or so, something has changed. We've seen what some publications have called the rise of millennial socialism. That was in the Economist, New Statesman, a couple of other publications too. What I meant by that was simply a revival of socialist ideas, and specifically among people in their 20s and 30s, so the millennial generation, and people who were returning to these ideas that we previously thought we had overcome. In that period, in the second half of the last decade, this was mostly associated with electoral projects, namely here in Britain, the Corbyn movement, in the United States, the movement around Bernie Sanders. But even though those movements ultimately didn't win in the electoral sense, they didn't dissolve afterwards. So the Labour Party now is of course a very different party compared to the Corbyn years, but nonetheless, this socialist movement that had sprung up around Corbyn didn't go away. It just migrated into other movements, and largely, in a lot of cases, movements that are not obviously about socialism, about planned economies, or about economics in any shape or form. There was, in 2020, of course, there was the explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement, where you could say, well, what's that got to do with economics? That's a movement, or was originally a movement against police violence, nothing to do with economics. But then, once they became popular, they said very explicitly on their fundraising website, we are an anti-racist movement and blah, blah, and we are also a movement against capitalism. And the same is true of Extinction Rebellion, where you could say, well, they're environmentalists. What's that got to do with economics? Apparently for them a lot, because they also say very openly, we are an anti-capitalist movement. And this is true of pretty much every social cause nowadays, that even if it doesn't start that way, even if it isn't in an obvious way about economics, it quite quickly acquires this anti-capitalist, pro-socialist undertone. And that is essentially where this enthusiasm, this millennial socialism movement of the past decade has migrated into. And if you've been in a bookstore recently, you will have noticed that there's no shortage of anti-capitalist books either. And a lot of them, like Degrowth Communism, World Beyond Capitalism, Vulture Capitalism, and all that, these are not competitors for Harry Potter, but they are bestsellers in their own genre. So these are not like, say, even in the 90s, you could, of course, find books like that, but you would have to go to some specialist Marxist bookshop, or it would not have been on the display table, say, whereas nowadays the display table is little else than this, at least in the politics section. So it is fair to say that these ideas that Hayek was describing in The Road to Serfdom have made a comeback. And we can see this in surveys as well. So there's this survey from last year by the Fraser Institute, which we've co-published with them, where they just presented a statement. Socialism is the ideal economic system. Do you agree with that? Yes or no? Among Generation Z, meaning people born from the mid-90s onwards, and millennials, more than half agree with that. And that's in line with various previous surveys, so that's not some outlier. That's to do with the wording of this particular survey or anything of that kind. And if you're familiar with surveys of this kind, you will know that it's quite difficult to get absolute majorities for anything, because a large chunk of people will just always respond, I don't know. And then it's pretty hard to have an absolute majority for anything. In this case, they manage, and this is not the only survey of its kind. Now, up until here, you could say, well, what does this mean, really? Is it really that bad? Do they really, what do these people mean when they talk about socialism? Do they really mean that in the classical sense? Are they talking about a planned economy, a state-run economy? Or are these people who think socialism means spending money on the NHS or something? What's interesting about the Fraser study is that they've tried to disentangle this. They've tried to go into what exactly do people have in mind when they talk about socialism. Is it a planned economy, or is it something more ill-defined and fluffy? So one way in which they've done this is they've simply replaced the more anodyne word socialism with the more radical-sounding word communism, and just check what happens. What happens to support? Does it fall? And the answer is, among Zoomers and millennials at least, yes, it does. Support does drop, but not by nearly as much as you might expect if it was really just a misunderstanding of a semantic nature. We still get 1 in 4 Zoomers and 1 in 3 millennials saying, yes, communism is the ideal economic system. So that's not an absolute majority, but we are still talking about millions of people here. And when you phrase it in a way which I think leaves no room for misunderstandings, the other way in which they've tried to work out what people mean when they say socialism is the ideal system is that they've simply presented a possible definition or description. And this one saying socialism involves government taking control of companies to control the economy. So this is basically describing a planned economy. This is the road to serfdom argument in its undiluted form. And it turns out among the general population, there is some ambiguity. There are about as many people who say, yes, that is what socialism means, as there are people who say, no, it means something different. However, among the self-described supporters of socialism, so those who answered yes to the previous question, the ones who answered yes, the ideal economic system is socialism, among them, the majority do approve of that. And surely when we talk about the socialism revival, what matters is what those who consider themselves socialists, what they mean by that. That's more important than what the general population thinks. And the self-described socialists do, in the majority, in the main, describe socialism in the classical sense. And this is also, again, mostly a generational phenomenon. If you break this down by generation, it turns out that among baby boomers, there's a slim majority who reject this definition. So for baby boomers, socialism means something else. If a baby boomer says I'm a socialist, then well, maybe that's harmless. Maybe they're just confused about the terminology. Millennials and Zoomers are not. They mean the real thing. So it's safe to say that this is not just a bunch of activists or a bunch of Twitter accounts. This is a real phenomenon, and you can see this in the survey data. Even if you ask questions that are not in an obvious way leading towards a particular answer, which of course raises the question, how did this happen? How can an idea that has clearly failed in practice and many times over still be popular? And the answer is quite simple. These self-described new socialists have very successfully dissociated themselves from previous versions of socialism. So here's an example. This is one of the so-called Bernie Bros, the founder of a socialist magazine. He says in his book, the authoritarian socialist regimes, and he puts that in inverted commas, of the 20th century did not deserve to be called socialist at all. Socialism does not mean control by the government, it means control by the people. So that is basically their answer. It just hasn't been done properly. The people who, previous socialist revolutionaries, just misunderstood what socialism was supposed to look like. Similar statement here from, this is also the founder of another socialist magazine, which is Jacobin, you may have come across. He also says socialism essentially meant, to Marx, radical democracy. It was not an authoritarian dictatorship. Marx described an egalitarian participatory democracy. And then he says socialism in the 20th century was a false start, which I guess is one way of putting it. And I could have filled hundreds of slides with quotes of that nature. So this isn't an outlier. This is basically the argument behind the socialism revival. It was just not done properly. People had misunderstood Marx's ideas. And the fact that socialism in the past has meant totalitarianism, that it's meant top-down control, bureaucratic planning, that was simply a political choice. So socialist regimes turn out that way because they wanted to be that way. And that's all there is to know about them. Which means that if you want to repeat it and do it in a better way, well, you just have to make different choices. If the nasty bits of socialism are just the result of political choices, then you just make different choices next time and problem solved. That is, of course, the exact opposite of what Hayek's argument was in The Road to Serfdom. He, of course, said that centrally planned economies lend themselves to totalitarian control, irrespective of what the intentions of the people in charge are. So this does not have to be deliberate. It doesn't mean that you have horrible people in charge, that the socialist leaders are all terrible sociopaths who want to make life miserable for the population for the sake of it. No, it's independent of the intentions of the people in charge. It is just in the nature of a planned economy that it firstly turns totalitarian, and secondly also that it can only be done in a bureaucratic and top-down way, as opposed to this idea of the participatory democracy. That was the original Hayekian argument, that it's not about intentions, it's a feature, not a bug. And he wasn't the first to make this argument. The earliest version of that argument, that socialism, that planned economies tend towards totalitarianism, that they cannot be organized in a meaningfully democratic way. The earliest version of that I found was from the 1890s, from a German liberal parliamentarian who wrote this book, Pictures of the Socialistic Future. So this was more than 20 years before the October Revolution. He had no actual socialist economy to go by and use as an example. He just described a purely hypothetical future socialist society. But nonetheless, it sounds quite suspiciously like the Soviet Union. He did see it coming, even though in his book there is no, well, I guess the difference with the actual Soviet Union is that there's no Stalin figure. So there are no bad people. He describes the socialist revolutionaries as genuine idealists. They have the best of intentions, but nonetheless, it just turns out once you take away market mechanisms, you are left with a problem, which is you still have to organize your economy in some way. And if there's no market coordination mechanisms left, what can replace it? Well, it's just command and control. And if there's a difference between what people want to do and what the planners want them to do, but then you have a problem. And this is how it turns totalitarian, even if nobody wants that, irrespective of anyone's intentions. That was the Hayekian argument, the Richter argument before him, that the new socialists have simply not taken on board. So it's not that they're saying, well, Hayek thought that, but we found a way around it. We found a way to somehow get around the Hayekian problems. It's not like that. They just either ignore him altogether or would describe some caricatured version of it. But of course, Hayek said that it is not an accident if a planned economy leads to totalitarianism. He said it has to lead to a massive concentration of power. In order to achieve their ends, the planners must create power over men, wielded by other men, of a magnitude never before known. That was the argument in the Road to Serfdom, that the power concentrated in the hands of the planning bureaucracy in a planned economy is not simply the sum of the powers of the individual capitalists that they had before, but it's something many times greater than that. It's several orders of magnitude greater than that. I think he uses the phrase, it's so large in degree that it's almost a difference in kind. And he was not alone in this. You can find a very similar statement from, oddly enough, Leo Trotsky, who also said, in his case, we're talking about the actual Soviet government, that there is no other government in the world in whose hands the fate of the whole country is concentrated to such a degree. The Soviet government occupies, in relation to the whole economic system, the position which a capitalist occupies in relation to one single enterprise. And this is just in the nature of that economic system. It's not an ideological choice, and even Trotsky completely agreed with that. He just thought he would do it better than Stalin, but there's no disagreement about this principle here. And secondly, Hayek also talked about how democratic socialism isn't really possible. It has to be in practice. It can only be technocratic rule. He said to draw up an economic plan in this fashion is even less possible. In this fashion, by that he meant in a democratic fashion, is even less possible than, for example, successfully to plan a military campaign by democratic procedure. It will become inevitable to delegate the task to the experts. Yet the difference is that while the general who is put in charge of a campaign is given a single end, there can be no such single goal given to the economic planner. So essentially saying, in practice, economic planning is something that can only be done by experts, by technocratic experts. True in other areas as well. It's just that in some areas that's not a problem. In the case of a military campaign, that's the case where we all agree on the outcome we want to see, and we're relatively indifferent how exactly you achieve it. Therefore, even though you have a technocratic institution, it is still democratic in a roundabout way, because it is still the government that this military institution is ultimately accountable to, and it is still a democratically elected government that decides the broad principles. So in this case, whether or not to go to war in the first place, that's still a democratic decision. It's just that they delegate specific tasks to technocrats, but economic planning cannot be done in this way, because here the whole problem is that we don't agree on the final outcome we want to see. And in this case, it's not a case where you can simply decide a broad principle and leave the details to the experts. It's more a case of where the entirety has to be delegated to the experts, because you cannot just come up with broad outlines unless you already know all the economic data, by which point you are no longer a democratic decision maker, you have become a technocrat. So that was the argument in the Road to Serfdom why democratic planning isn't really realistically possible. And again, this is not exclusive to Hayek, that argument. Harold Lasky, one of his opponents and the first post-war chairman of the Labour Party, essentially also said that already 12 years earlier, and Hayek quotes him on that. Lasky said the present parliamentary machine is quite unsuited to pass rapidly great body of complicated legislation. And this was, he was talking about the British state as it was in the 1930s. So this is, of course, this is many times greater today. And he said the national government has admitted this by implementing its economic measures, not by detailed debate in the House of Commons, but by a wholesale system of delegated legislation, so what we would call quangos today. You hear lots of complaints about the quango state, also from the political right. In their case, quite like socialists, they also see this as simply a political choice. They also think, well, it's just politicians have somehow made the choice to delegate more and more tasks to quangos. And that's the whole problem. We need to bring everything back in-house, debate everything in the House of Commons. But Lasky, even though he was a socialist himself, already saw in the early 30s that isn't realistically possible. That you ultimately have to subcontract the complex and technical bits to committees of experts, and that therefore democratic planning in the conventional sense is a complete impossibility. So those were the original Hayekian arguments, and which the modern socialists are just not responding to and keep ignoring, even though it's not just Hayek who said this, it's even people broadly on their own side. Another argument they like to make is that they like to go back to earlier figures earlier socialist thinkers who criticized totalitarian aspects in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, and say, well, look, this shows that there was an alternative. They just chose the wrong brand of Marxism, the wrong brand of socialism. But even there, if you go back to these earlier critics, and if you look at what was their alternative, usually turns out there wasn't much. They were just criticizing it because it didn't match the outcomes they wanted to see. So one figure that comes up quite frequently by the new socialists is Rosa Luxemburg, who was the founder of the German Communist Party in 1918, 1919. She wrote this book about a criticism of early Soviet Russia, of Russia after the Russian Revolution, criticizing some of Lenin's measures, and some of it viewed in isolation looks like a perceptive critique. For example, she did say freedom only for the supporters of the government is no freedom at all. Freedom is always and exclusively freedom for the one who thinks differently. And some socialists today like to point out to figures like her, and in order to say, well, look, there was this alternative that was available, it was just not chosen. Or here, where she talks about the bureaucracy taking over, saying without general elections, without unrestricted freedom of press and assembly, without free struggle of opinion, life dies out in every public institution, in which only the bureaucracy remains as the active element. Again, on its own, this looks like a perceptive critique of what the Soviet Union would later be like. It's just that if we look at what exactly her alternative was, well, there wasn't really anything. She then said that the dictatorship must proceed by the active participation of the masses. It must be under their direct influence, subject to the control of public activity, and so on. It must arise out of growing political training of the masses. Okay, that sounds good in the abstract, but that's just paraphrasing the original intentions. But the Hayekian argument is that, well, that may well be the intention. It's just that you're not going to get that. And she had no particular mechanism to get that version of socialism either. She just observed that Soviet Russia wasn't what she thought it was going to be, and therefore came up with this criticism because she wasn't in charge. She didn't have to do it. She could just criticize it from hundreds of kilometers away. And similarly here, she also said the only effective means in the hands of the proletarian revolution are the kindling of revolutionary idealism, which can be maintained over any length of time only through the intensively active life of the masses themselves. Again, yeah, but that's just abstract rhetoric. That doesn't address the Hayekian argument. How do you do this in practice? What do you do if it turns out that firstly, the masses do not want to be actively involved in politics all the time, and even if they do, that you cannot really make detailed technical decisions in such a manner. So by just paraphrasing the old idea, you're not really getting anywhere. And similarly, there's this famous quote here, Bertolt Brecht, who was a friendly critic of the early East German government, who came up with this famous, an extract from a poem. Would it not be easier for the government to dissolve the people and elect another? And he's mainly remembered for this critique, and also some of the modern socialists would say, well, look, there was this alternative. This man did describe himself as a Marxist, but he criticized the regime from within. But nonetheless, he did not have much of an alternative either. Where he talks about what he would do differently, what he says is production had the character of a means to an end, and it was not in itself considered enjoyable or voluntary. From the point of view of socialism, we must make producing the real purpose of life and design it in such a way that it is tempting in itself. So basically he's saying, well, all you have to do is make sure that work is always great fun, and then you will not have a problem. Well, that's not much of an alternative. Why has nobody thought of this before? And that's every time modern socialists come up with a figure who supposedly saw it all coming and represented a better alternative, if you look at what their supposed alternative was, you will find empty platitudes like this. So short summary, the bad ideas that Hayek was battling with in the 1940s are back. We still have to make that argument. The only good news is that we don't really have to do any upskilling or retraining, because it's not even that we're dealing with an opponent who is making a new version of the old arguments. No, it's the same old bad ideas that Hayek was already battling with. They're still with us today. Thank you.